title The Shadow of Millennium. Setting, a small, fog-covered English village named Ashcombe, nestled in the Cotswolds, England. The story is set in January 2000, just after the turn of the millennium. Act 1, The Arrival, 15 minutes. Introduction. Helen Wright, a 35-year-old investigative journalist for a London-based newspaper, arrives in Ashcombe to investigate a series of mysterious disappearances that have plagued the village since the new year. 3 locals have vanished without a trace over the last 2 weeks, and rumors are spreading of strange occurrences at night. With her curiosity piqued and her desire for a good story stronger than ever, Helen decides to stay at the only inn in the village, the Fox and Hound. Setting the tone. The village of Ashcombe is eerily quiet, with its narrow cobblestone streets and centuries-old cottages shrouded in a heavy mist. The villagers are distrustful of outsiders, especially a journalist. They seem nervous, glancing over their shoulders and whispering amongst themselves. An old woman, Mrs. Marlowe, warns Helen to leave before it's too late, muttering about the shadow that has come to claim them. The catalyst. Helen meets with the local police officer, Sergeant Robert Mason, who reluctantly shares details of the missing persons cases. Each disappearance happened at night, always near the abandoned Ashcombe Manor, an old estate on the outskirts of the village that had been empty for decades. The police have found no leads, no signs of struggle, just vanished without a trace. Act 2. The Investigation, 15 to 35 minutes. First clue. Determined to uncover the truth, Helen begins her investigation by visiting the families of the missing people. She speaks to Margaret Wood, whose teenage son disappeared on New Year's Eve. Margaret reveals that her son had been drawn to Ashcombe Manor with some of his friends, daring each other to spend the night there. The others returned, terrified and incoherent, but her son did not. A strange encounter. Helen decides to explore Ashcombe Manor herself. As she walks through the fog-covered woods leading to the manor, she meets a reclusive man named Thomas Gray who lives in a rundown cabin nearby. Thomas warns her of the curse that lies within the manor, a shadow that preys on those who venture too close. He claims to have seen the shadow himself, but refuses to elaborate further. Discovery at the manor. Helen reaches Ashcombe Manor, its imposing Gothic architecture crumbling with age, and finds the gates chained shut. She manages to squeeze through and begins her exploration. Inside, she discovers strange symbols carved into the walls and an unsettling chill in the air, despite the manor being sealed tight. In one room, she finds a torn piece of fabric that matches the jacket described by Margaret as belonging to her son. Supernatural encounter. As night falls, Helen hears whispers echoing through the empty halls. Suddenly, a shadowy figure darts past her, sending a wave of cold fear down her spine. She tries to follow it, but it seems to vanish into thin air. She takes some photographs of the symbols and the strange shadows lurking in the corners. Act 3, The Conspiracy, 35 to 50 minutes. Uncovering the past. Back in the village, Helen researches Ashcombe Manor's history and discovers that it belonged to an aristocratic family, the Ashcombes, who were rumored to practice dark rituals in the 1800s. The manor was abandoned after a series of tragic deaths in the family, which were said to be linked to a failed ritual involving a creature called the Shadow. Villagers who tried to investigate over the years had met with accidents or gone missing. Thomas's revelation. Helen returns to Thomas Gray's cabin, demanding more information. Reluctantly, Thomas reveals that he is the last descendant of the Ashcombe family. He confesses that he tried to perform a ritual to banish the shadow permanently, but it only made it stronger. Now it preys on the village, growing bolder with each passing day. A plan to end the nightmare. Helen convinces Thomas to help her try one last time to end the curse. They decide to go back to Ashcombe Manor and perform a counter-ritual, using the symbols and information Helen gathered during her investigation. Sergeant Mason, who was initially skeptical of Helen's theories, agrees to accompany them after witnessing some of the strange phenomena she captured in her photographs. Act 4. The final confrontation, 50 to 60 minutes. The ritual. The 3 of them return to the manor under the cover of darkness. The fog is thicker than ever, and an unnatural silence hangs in the air. Inside, they prepare the ritual, lighting candles and drawing symbols on the floor of the main hall. The temperature drops suddenly, and the shadows in the corners of the room seem to stretch and warp, creeping closer. The shadow attacks. As they begin chanting, the air grows colder, and the whispers return, louder and more menacing. Suddenly, the shadow appears, a formless, dark mass with glowing red eyes. It lunges at them, throwing objects across the room and extinguishing the candles. Thomas is thrown against a wall, injuring him. Helen and Sergeant Mason barely manage to avoid being overwhelmed. A sacrifice for freedom. Thomas, realizing what must be done, grabs Helen's hand and thrusts an old family ring into her palm. He explains that the shadow is tied to the bloodline, and only by sacrificing himself can it be banished. Before Helen or Mason can react, Thomas steps into the center of the ritual circle and begins chanting in a language neither of them understands. The climax. The shadow roars, its form writhing in agony as it is drawn toward Thomas. The manor shakes violently and the walls crack. Helen and Mason are forced to flee as the entire building begins to collapse. Outside, they watch as Ashcombe Manor is consumed by darkness, then implodes in a blinding flash of light. Resolution. As the sun rises, the fog begins to lift for the first time in weeks. Helen writes her story, knowing it will be one of the most unbelievable accounts she's ever published. The village begins to return to normal, and the missing people slowly reappear, disoriented but unharmed, claiming they were trapped in a dark void. Helen leaves Ashcombe, her investigation complete, but haunted by the memory of the shadow and Thomas's sacrifice. Closing scene. As Helen drives away, she notices in her rearview mirror a faint shadow flitting across the road behind her, followed by a whisper carried by the wind. "It's never over.